As there is considerable similarity among some of these questions, which might be expected as we have somewhat restricted the area, I've taken the liberty of arranging them, at least a few of them, in a sequence so that we would eliminate as much repetition as possible. I would like to point out that in this particular discussion, the answers will be based upon my personal convictions on these matters, supported by my researches in philosophy and comparative religion. There is no intention whatever to present a dogmatic point of view or to insist that anyone agree with the answer that I give. It is the best answer that I can give, and each person can apply it or accept it or question it according to his own inclinations. The first question I selected because it sort of seemed like a first problem in relationship to this. Question. A co-worker attended college for 10 years and majored in psychology. This man said in effect that there is no scientific proof of a hereafter. If there is not, how does one know about the welfare of departed loved ones? This question is so frequently the basis of metaphysical scientific argument that I think we should give it some consideration. In the first place, I feel that Professor James of Harvard, who was one of the pioneers in psychology and still one of the most respected names in the field, was fully correct when he stated that if there be no scientific proof of immortality, there is no scientific proof that immortality is not true. It is simply a matter which lies outside of the range of scientific research. Science relates to matter and to forms and things visible or cognizable. It relates to certain exactitudes of processes, belonging essentially to the problem of matter, and matter in its various modes, forms, and procedures. There is nothing whatever known to science today which actually disproves immortality. It simply belongs to a different level of human thought. Philosophy takes the attitude that there are two valid sequences of evidence available to man. One is scientific or physical, and the other is rational or mental. That the findings of a trained, rational mind may have just as much scientific validity as the results of laboratory research. This is a claim that was made by the ancients, more or less justifying their claim by anticipating philosophically most of the important scientific discoveries of later ages. Nearly always we find a great and rich wisdom in nature's ways of doing things. Nature surrounds us with transitory situations, and very often with problems that can only be solved by a major shifting of the elements on the chessboard of life. An individual may be heavily overshadowed through the greater part of a lifetime by a dominant parent. If this parent finally passes on, the individual is at wit's end. He has not done his own thinking. He has not lived his own life. He may well have reached a condition in years or habits in which it finds it difficult, if not impossible, to reestablish his own psychological entirety. Under such conditions, it is convenient, but not good, for this person to attempt to communicate with the deceased individual and let the dominance continue on by psychic means for the rest of life. This achieves very little. In fact, it can detract from the possibility of the person finally creating a personal orientation. Usually, we find that nature demands that we stand on our own feet. And somewhere in life we are forced to do so. Often this is the result of separation, either by death or other causes. If the person thus separated and invited by nature to stand on his own feet chooses rather to lean upon psychic phenomena, there's a grave question whether or not he is not defeating the essential purpose of nature, which is to create the individual who is self-sustaining. Now, this does not mean that we should not have the deepest regard for other people, that we should not sacrifice for them, and perhaps feel ourselves bound by duties to perhaps relinquish a large part of our personal claim upon living in order to serve them or meet their need. But if nature in its own way finally dissolves this bond, there is a grave question whether we should attempt to prolong it. In doing so, we may merely drift through the years. Yet at the time when this can happen, this drifting through the years seems the most comfortable and desirable state. And sometimes, under the illusion of our own grief, we seek merely to prolong a habit of permitting others to make our decisions, a habit of leaning upon someone else, because it is easier than standing on our own feet. We will not admit this consciously, we do not know it consciously. But as a subconscious fact, it can be important to us in our own development. There are times when, unquestionably, efforts to communicate with those who have passed on for really legitimate and urgent matters have apparently been highly productive of good. But I would say that such cases are of the exception, and that the person, regardless of his affection, will be wiser to recognize the importance of perhaps fulfilling that which is the greatest internal need for the person who has passed on. Let us take an example of this. Let us take the possibility of a highly dominant parent who insisted upon running a child's life until finally death came. I know one example of this in which the parent finally died in the advanced 90s, leaving behind them a child already nearly 70, who had been completely dominated for the entire lifetime. Now, this parent was well-meaning, kind-hearted, but brought up in a school of tradition in which children always obeyed their parents as long as the parent lived. That the complete subjection of the child was nothing more than a reasonable, natural, and proper state of affairs. There was no sense of moral guilt. The parent did not want to admit that they were selfish, but they carefully and pointedly broke up every opportunity of this child to marry. They did not want to be alone, and underneath the parent's tremendous possessiveness was a great deal of selfishness. Now let us assume for a moment that this parent passes on, and due to perhaps clarification, a little more perspective, the parent perhaps might, separated from the child, begin to recognize some of the problem. It would be the child's duty to assist this parent by liberating itself. If the child had really had the amount of character appropriate, it would have achieved this liberation during lifetime. And during this lifetime would therefore have made the greatest possible communication of good to the parent. Because actually the child was catering to the delinquency of the parent. If the parent has any character or quality whatsoever, the parent would not want this, and certainly would not want it to continue after death, but would rather regret that it had dominated too long, and might feel a little unhappy, and justifiably so, if it realized that because of its domination the child was unable to escape and was now trying to communicate with Mama through the Ouija board. It would just be the perpetuation of something that was wrong all the way along. Therefore, if there be justice in nature, and if death produces any enlargement of consciousness whatsoever, even by natural transition, then certainly the parent would not want the child to continue in such a relationship. For this reason, and for many other reasons, first, because of the difficulty in determining the validity of psychic phenomena, the difficulty in deciding whether the deceased person was going to give any better advice than they gave during life, and some of them gave very bad advice through the long years of their sojourn here. I would say that in general, and unless there were some extraordinary mitigating circumstance, that the person is better not to attempt such communication with those who have passed on. If the person is doing it only for their own selfish desire for comfort, that will not make the picture any prettier. So it still remains the same answer. Someone asked the question, can we help those who have died? Yes, I think we can, to a certain degree. Assuming that immortality is a fact, and assuming that the veil between the two worlds has an opening both ways, it is conceivable that as man has undoubtedly had authentic communication with those that have passed on at various times during history, it is quite possible that such communication might go also in the opposite direction. It is also quite possible that a certain psychic sympathy exists between persons who have been near, and that this psychic sympathy can exercise its influence in both directions. There are persons who have no intention of attempting to communicate with the deceased of any kind, and yet do sense a certain nearness, a certain time in which they feel the thoughts and emotions of loved ones. It is quite possible that this is also possible in the opposite direction. I think we can help most those who loved us while they were here by being worthy of them, by being true to the principles which they would have admired, and to live well. One of the old Greek philosophers once said to his disciple, the greatest proof of the wisdom I have given you, and the greatest joy that can come to my heart, is that you shall live well without me. This is the great joy of those who are truly our friends. Not that we shall depend upon them, but that we shall live well in ourselves and of ourselves, and to fulfill the reasonable courses of life, to go on in this world finding happiness and peace and security, to build a good life, to meet the responsibilities of living as honorably as we can. I think this would be the greatest favor that we can confer upon those who have passed on. I do not believe that any token that we can leave to them, any monument we can build for them, any memorial we can compose for them, would bring honorable persons as much joy as to know that those whom they loved are happy, useful, busy people, doing those things which are of common value to mankind. I think, therefore, this is the way in which we can bring the greatest peace to them. If they are selfish people still and do not want this, then again, I think it is our duty not to cater to them, but to enlighten them. And in so doing, to ensure that we no longer make any of those kinds of mistakes which perhaps we made while they were in this world. Now, I realize very definitely that To a great many persons, the loss of one near and loved is one of the great tragedies of life. It is a tragedy which can dim the purposes of our own survival, make life comparatively meaningless to us, and cause us to desire rather to be with them than to go on without them. These natural associations, strengthened and enriched by a lifetime, these are perfectly natural and reasonable. And where they exist, I do not believe that any word spoken by anyone or any quotation from a learned work could change that peculiar pain or bring ease to that kind of interior suffering. The only thing that the individual so bereaved has at his disposal is his own philosophy of life, his own convictions about value, his own understanding of what he believes the one who has passed on would want for him. I have asked this question of hundreds of survivors, and the answer of one is typical of all. What do you think that the person who has gone would want for you? And the instant answer was, John would want me to be happy. I think this is reasonable. And I think we come the nearest to understanding this when we attempt to fulfill such a conviction. Socrates admonished his disciples under no conditions to weep for him. Plato decided that the best way to celebrate his own passing would be a banquet in which everyone enjoyed themselves and perhaps gave a toast or two for him. He wanted no morbid sentiments. Unlike the Egyptians who liked hired mourners, he did not wish this, which was common in his own time. Perhaps the Egyptians were wise at that, because certainly the wails of individuals wailing for so much an hour could have very little effect upon the spirit of the passed one. He knew perfectly well that the mourners did not even know who was dead. If, however, our own wail for us, if we have any consciousness of this fact, we will not be happy. If we find in this world someone weeping for us, we wish to comfort them and beg them not to do so, and try to lift them out of their despondency. Or if they are weeping from other causes, we wish to bring them peace, happiness, and we will do all that we can to remove the tears from them. I think the deceased, if aware of our life here, certainly would have the same mind and would not regard undue grief as loyalty, would not regard weeping or moaning or the continual preservation of a state of isolation, would not regard this as desirable, proper, or suitable. Certainly not if they cared for the person who survived them. Therefore, I do not think that the deceased would appreciate a situation that I knew about at one time in which an individual carried around with them an urn with the ashes of a departed relative and always placed it over the mantel when they moved into a new apartment. This, I think, would be of no joy to the deceased. I don't know whether the deceased would be worried about the problem of frequent transportation, but certainly this continuance of a relationship became morbid. It became unhealthy. And the proof of it was that the person involved finally became psychotic. This is not certainly what any person conscious beyond life would want for anyone left here. I think we must sometimes also bear in mind that somewhere, sometime, we were not here, and that the various patterns or relationships of life went on. In the future, we will not be here, and the conditions will go on. There is the old saying, the king is dead, long live the king. And the individual perhaps, who passes on is most happy in the fact that he is gently but quietly allowed to slip into the gentler parts of memory and remain there as a quiet and beautiful thought, not likely to disturb or agitate the problems of the living. I think maybe one answer is to just figure out how we would feel. If you have a child whom you love, would you want that child to go grieving year after year after you are gone? Would you consider this a proper fulfillment, a reasonable expression of affection? Or would you be frightened for this child, realizing that these differences and changes of condition are inevitable, and that they are therefore part of a divine plan, and to the degree that we interfere with this plan, by unreasonable attitudes, we are injuring ourselves and those for whom we care. If, therefore, we must kind of keep a memory green, why not keep it green by dedicating to it some present attitude, some present purpose? Let us do better than we ever did before. Let us be more useful than we ever were before. And let this be the tribute to our beloved dead. Now let's see. If we contact those departed on a thought level, then such contacts would be due to being surrounded by only our own thoughts. They would not be reciprocal thoughts given by another. That could be true or it would not be true, depending. If we contact on a thought level, it would not necessarily mean, as James points out, that our own thoughts would be all that would be available to us. Rather, that transmission between two states or conditions might be upon a level of mind rather than a level of matter. We would have to assume that two beings existing in different conditions could only communicate through some common ground that they both share. If mental continuance is a truth in the universe, then it is upon a mental level or upon some level of psychic or soul power that communication between two states would be possible. For whereas the other person no longer has body and therefore cannot communicate directly by body, it may communicate through that which both the survivor and the deceased possess, and that is mind. Therefore, mental or psychical communication is possible without implying that it is merely the thought of the living person. But here is your tricky situation. What degree of it is the thought of the living person, and what degree is communication? This is very hard to determine. And even in the presence of so-called psychical phenomena, which apparently defies the laws of matter, still certain doubts and problems remain. For we know that not only psychical precipitations are possible, but also tangible precipitations. And the fact that a table moves or a slate is written on is not bona fide evidence of the presence of an external or separate entity. These things can be projected from the self in exactly the same way that they are projected by a Hindu yogi. So we are not sure, and in this uncertainty we must be to a degree cautious. And where we are not sure, and we do not know, and we are willing to admit that we do not know, then our greatest recourse is on the level of ethics. Not knowing these other things, we must weigh things and cling to that which is good, preserving the virtue of our own lives, preserving the integrity of our own conduct, and depending upon the insight we have gained from those we care for the perpetuation and progression of our own life under our own leadership. This seems to be the most conservative and most certain way to avoid unreasonable difficulties. The second part of the question is, if all of life is learning in the body or not, then it seems less likely that there would be reciprocal thought contacts, since the departed one would be progressing in his own way, not necessarily returning to those here in the body. If the above is true, then we really do live only within ourselves. That we do have our immortality locked curiously within the compound of our own nature is a fact that is gradually dawning upon our realization. That the after-death condition is a state rather than a place is reasonably certain to us at this time. But it is not certain or inevitable that these states have no possibility of intercommunication, any more than it is certain that the psychic nature of man, though recognized as a psychological totality, has no contact with anything outside of itself. Just as surely as this universe is filled with cosmic rays which beat upon various structures in nature, so it is very possible that the psyche of man, though a complete entity in itself, is capable of being influenced by other powers separate from itself. Here again we come into a difficult and confusing pattern. So the only logical and reasonable point is that such is possible. But out of this possibility we must not hasten to build probabilities or certainties. We must accept these things as belonging as yet to an unknown land, about which all dogmatic concept is rather untimely. Is it disturbing to the repose of a recently departed soul if the family constantly thinks of the departed or calls on the departed to answer questions? As one upon a witness stand under legal questioning, I would say that yes would be the brief answer to this. I would feel that perhaps the Buddhist or the Tibetan philosophy might give a point to this particular thing. That those recently bereaved are going to think about the deceased is inevitable. We just cannot expect human beings to wipe these things out, and it would be called heartless if they did. And to a measure it would be heartless. There would be little love indeed that could be wiped out by a platitude. On the other hand, there is a natural attitude on these problems, and there is an artificial one. It would seem to me that the natural attitude would be one deeply unselfish, kindly, and of good point. If the person who has passed on has come to this end as a result of suffering and considerable pain and misery, or through the gradual loss of faculties and abilities and powers until they could no longer live the life they wanted to live, then their release should be a quiet source of gratitude. We should realize that it is the greatest good for them. And about this good, we should have no selfish sense of personal loss. Therefore, in our quietude, if we think things through, we shall probably realize that that which happened is right. And out of this rightness, we have a quiet sense of strength. This quiet sense of strength, this cheerful attitude of release, I do not believe could be regarded as harmful. The soldier going to war leaves behind him a wife and small child. The natural instinct of that wife, and that soldier also, will be that this parting be as brave as possible. Neither one will want the other to have the last memory of a tearful person. They will smile even though they want to cry. And perhaps after the separation, and they can no longer see each other, their tears will come. But they will certainly try to give courage and strength to the one they love, not weakness. And if there be any knowledge between these worlds, the kindest thing that we can do is to convey as far as we can to the person who is gone that we understand, that we are strong enough to bear this, and that our only thought is their well-being. If we are not quite big enough for that, and sometimes it seems that we cannot be immediately that big, then I think we should bear in mind that little people, the little soldier going off to war, he came from no wise background. His little wife may have been a stenographer or a housekeeper. No learning, no wisdom, no great philosophy. Simply affection, the kindly love of people, which makes them want to save each other tears. This is available to all of us. And perhaps in the simplest way, we can achieve this greater end. Certainly, we should not carry on in an undignified manner. Certainly, we should not make difficult the transition of another person if that person is close to us and if we can control the situation. In Buddhist countries, it is usual to allow the deceased person to remain quiet, particularly immediately after death. Just at that moment when the doctor says they're gone, that is the moment which, according to the Tibetan philosophy, which is a good philosophy, at that time, every survivor must be strong. That is not the time to howl. That is the time to quietly sit down and send our minds with the noblest, kindest, and most generous of thoughts to encourage this soul in its transition. Whether we believe or not, the idea is good. It is the noblest way, so that at that moment when grief is most likely to burst forth, that is the moment when it should not do so. And that is the moment also when those of devout faith in any religion should call upon their faith and realize that in this moment a man's religion is revealed in his own conduct. And it is best revealed when his thoughts are immediately for another and not for himself. The second part of this question is more or less covered, namely the calling upon the departed to answer questions. I would say we have already touched upon sufficiently. If we are wise in these things, my suggestion is that when someone is gone, that we gradually allow this fact to become real to us. That we realize that this person has two survivals, one in himself and one in us. That the survival in himself he takes with him. His survival in us is a picture or a likeness or a memory which is in our subconscious as long as we live, and perhaps longer, we do not know. But in this time and under these conditions, it is very important for us to realize that we must integrate, that we must create a purposeful existence, that nature does not intend the hopes of the living to be buried with the dead. Had nature so intended, the entire structure of the universe would have been different. That certain remembrance is right and proper. That certain continuing thoughtfulness is right. And certainly the loved person remains in us as an image, unforgettable, as long as our own faculties survive. But we strongly recommend that outside catalyzing agents be slowly but inevitably dispensed with. The things by which our minds are caused externally to become reminded too frequently of the deceased person, these things are not good for us. Therefore, the keeping of too many of the memento mori, the keeping of the old pictures, the keeping of the things cherished, the keeping of the chair, and all of this, these things are not good. And as the individual finally settles down to the full facing of life, he should gradually dispose of those things which externally bind him to the dead, because the only tie that is real is his own consciousness. These other things will affect his mind and keep on creating mental patterns that may not be too good to have. What is the best prayer or method of assisting one who has passed on? One of the most simple and common prayer experiences that we all share in Western life is the Lord's Prayer. This is very suitable for the occasion. Another very suitable religious thought is that which is contained in the 23rd Psalm. These are simple. They help us to restate our own faith. They help the individual, if he is aware of our intercession, to remember things of his own life that were meaningful and helpful to him. Actually, quiet or silent prayer, a prayer of assurance of release, this also may be regarded as helpful. Probably the one emotion or one condition which is most useful is a quietude, a sense of internal peace, an inward statement of the rightness of things, and the realization in this critical time, as Walt Whitman so beautifully pointed out, that death is not an enemy but a friend, and also that in this universe nature desires no losses, but that these losses are of appearance only, but that in the fact of things, the universe is life, all life is growing. We have some people whom we know, and some whom we care for. But in this universe, there are all people, and all people are worth knowing, and all people are worth caring for. We cannot know them all, but we can, through our own experience, establish a pattern by which we can gradually universalize our affections and our emotions until we feel quietly and sincerely the ever-changing pattern of life. Every time a watch ticks a second, someone in this world passes on. And every time this watch clicks a second, somewhere a babe is born. This grand pattern must give us certain understanding. And we must have this same understanding that is so beautifully set forth in the Bhagavad Gita, that certain is death for the living, and certain is life for the dead, and over the inevitable we shall not grieve. This quietude, this sense of peace, can do no harm, but can do great good, both to the living and to those who have passed on. Here is a question in which we have a number of little minor subdivisions. Which of these three probabilities is most likely? That a person of average qualities who passes away 10 years ago is at the present time, first, still interested in the welfare of loved ones on earth, or second, assimilating the experiences of earthly life, or third, reincarnated. I would say that the third probability is remote. The individual, unless under extraordinary circumstances, is not likely to be reborn. Reincarnation in so short a time would be distinctly one of the extraordinary occurrences of nature. As to the other two, in the period of 10 years, I would say that presuming the fact to be available, that the individual is able to be aware of what is occurring in this world, that there would be interest in the welfare of those who are here, because the patterns on earth would be considerably the same. And as a living parent would be interested in the growth of children or grandchildren, so we may assume that with these close ties which extend from earth experience, that the chances are considerable that there would be some cognition, interest, or awareness. Life would certainly be number two, which would be going on all the time anyway, namely the assimilating of the experiences of earthly life. This assimilation, however, does not necessarily mean no other interest, any more than the person going to school thinks of nothing else. It could well be that the assimilation of experience would be very important, but part of that experience might be the possibility of observing among survivors the consequences of patterns set in motion during life. The individual who passed on and left his 10 millions to his relatives might find a due and proper karma in the way in which his relatives wasted it. He had a lesson to learn, and it is not impossible that 10 years would not give him any more time than necessary to learn it. It is also quite probable that orientation problems would result in the possibility of conscious connection with life. It might occur and it might not occur. I think there are many things we have to consider in matters of this kind. I was the executor of the estate of a very elderly lady who passed on. She was on the county. The executive problems were not very heavy, but she had survived all of her relatives, her friends, and her loved ones. She was totally alone. She had no one close to her, no one whom she could even name as a possible individual to notify. That such a person under such conditions would probably slip into a complete state of detachment is quite likely. They had very little to bind them here. Philosophy had already enriched the inner life to the degree that there was no fear of this transition, but only a realization that it was the best possible thing. Fortunately, the end came very quietly and without unusual pain. This person would be very unlikely to have long contact with anything here, because there was nothing left here to contact. On the other hand, a young man with small children killed in an accident might very definitely feel the need or the sense of inevitable drawing by which he might certainly be aware and try and help and guide these young people. In the collections of psychic episodes and anecdotes by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and Sir Oliver Lodge, there are a number of psychic circumstances which seem to indicate a very good possibility of intercession of a deceased person under these conditions to try and save someone to whom they had a great attachment in life but of recent date. And there are also files in a number of other groups relating to these things. It is conceivable that if consciousness can bridge this interval, we have no proof that it cannot, that the degree of interest in those who survive would depend upon the circumstances in which these persons are placed, the sense of responsibility. The older person whose life has been well lived, who has properly released their children, and who is ready to face the future for experience and growth, most likely will go right on along the path. And certainly such an individual should not be encouraged to pause, because the work of this life is as nearly finished as they could finish it with what they knew and what they were, and these are the important factors. Naturally, assimilation of experience also implies some recognition, remembrance, or realization of things experienced here, and thereby requiring recollection in order that the experience factor may be understood. Here's another question in the same general spirit. To what extent is it possible or desirable for former marriage partners to communicate after one has died? What may the one on this side give? I seem to receive more than I give. Here is a very intricate question from a psychological standpoint. And let's take a situation right here in this world instead of going beyond the grave. Supposing you were the mother of a fine, happy, normal daughter who grew up and in her late teens or early 20s formed a successful marriage. After 2 or 3 years, or perhaps more, maybe 10 years of married life, her husband, in whom she had great regard, and the marriage was a success, passed on. And you as a parent would have to counsel, in a little way at least, a woman perhaps in her early 30s, with 1 or 2 children, as to what kind of a future life she should live. Would you advise that girl never to marry again, but to remain until she passed on in continual loving memory of the deceased husband? If you gave such advice, your friends would probably raise their eyebrows, and your daughter might very well neglect it. You would not be likely to give the advice, however. You would tell her that after a reasonable time that she should try to find happiness again. That it would certainly be unwise and unreasonable, it would be unfair to the children, if this person simply gradually developed a deep-set neurosis and settled down to a long life of grieving. I know one elderly woman who died here about 8 years ago, whose husband died a year after their marriage. She was 18 when he died, and she remained in deep mourning for the rest of her 80 years. This was not of any value, however. It was regarded as a marvelous loyalty, and there are people to whom such experiences are probably inevitable because of their own psychological makeup. But it would certainly not be a condition that we would counsel a person to follow, unless their own disposition was peculiarly and deeply set in such patterns. Now, if under the same circumstances, persons separated by death attempt to reestablish or maintain communication with each other, I would say a number of factors would influence my feelings on this. If these persons were of advanced years, and in all probabilities the survivor had only a reasonable probability of survival, then that would be one problem. Certainly you would not necessarily think it likely or reasonable or probable that this person, the survivor, would reestablish a new home here. If, however, these persons were in middle life, with years ahead of them, I believe that psychologically speaking, socially speaking, religiously speaking, the greater advantages would be that the survivor attempts to create a new life. And if certainly the case involved very young people, that would be even more definitely true. That being the probable proper solution to the situation, the one which will enrich through experience, because negation does not enrich. Negation can only impoverish. It is only by doing things and being people that we grow. To sit back and grieve is not enrichment of life. It is not the use nature intended to have made of faculties. So if by communicating with a person who has passed on, we have a tendency to prevent a life in its younger years or even in its middle years from developing new interests or breaking out into new patterns or creating new experiences. If such communication limits this possibility or subtracts from our interest in creating a new personal life, I would say that such communication is not desirable. And that no matter how much comfort it brings, it is not the right kind of comfort. Because the type of comfort and happiness we really need will be developed through our useful adjustments in this life, and that we should seek the consolation and growth of new experience rather than to permit ourselves to fall into a negation of this kind. Now, it might well be that we do receive comfort, that we are not quite so alone as the result of such communication, that we sense a certain faith. These things may be important to us, and they can be very important. And if that is the way we feel about it, that is certainly what we are going to do about it, regardless of what anyone advises. Because I have seldom, if ever, known a person to really take advice that was basically contrary to their own inclinations. If they are sort of uncertain, perhaps they can be moved a little. But if they have a certain attitude, they are going to defend that attitude, and advice is going to have very little effect upon them. But I would definitely say that if the person is gaining comfort from such a relationship, that they should seek some answer in themselves as to whether or not they are gaining real progress. Is this comfort, consolation, or is this invitation to grow? Is the individual simply allowing life to slip by and not making dynamic adjustments, satisfied to rest in the ease of comfort? My experience with nature is that nature, beyond a certain measure, does not seem to like comfort. Nature does not apparently intend us to be comfortable. And if it was God's will that comfort should be supreme, there is something definitely wrong in the universe. What nature seems to like best is that we are occasionally very uncomfortable. So uncomfortable that we change our ways and do better. Therefore, I would say that comfort can be exaggerated. That perhaps for a few months, a year or two after a parting of close persons, the consolation and comfort factor might be rather important. But that for a steady diet from then on, comfort is not very important. Of course, nature also has many tricks up its very full sleeves. One of these is that the average person simply is unable to grieve consecutively very long. After a year or two, changes occur in the psychic life of the person. He begins to emerge from loss and begins to take a new interest in life as it is. He is drawn back into society and frequently does the thing which he believes he couldn't possibly do, find someone else to care for. Nature apparently would like to have it that way, because nature would rather that we give our love to the service of the living than to shadows about which we cannot be sure. So I would say that a person who feels that they may be receiving more than they are giving, that the best thing for them to do is to start giving more. They cannot give very much to the person who is God. They cannot do those countless little things that make life beautiful and gracious here. But there are people in this world they can do these things for, and perhaps bring peace and happiness to someone else who has been deprived by loss, or been disillusioned by a less fortunate series of circumstances. And if what we, of our attitude, of the way we feel, locks us against these natural changes, I think we endanger ourselves and do very little good to anyone else. Let us not be too insistent upon comfort. Let us not lean too heavily upon memories, or upon this vague sense of presence, or upon some message that comes either to ourselves or through an intermediary of some kind. Let us rather assume that these things are probably true. Let's not question them or doubt them, but let's try to build and live important lives for ourselves right here and now, and also try to help those who are still struggling with uncertainties or must go through problems here which are no longer possible for the one who has passed on. In this strange world in which we live, the problems of this world belong to the people who are here. And unless we do something better with them than we have been, it's going to be a rather sad world. And for us to turn from trying to do the things that are here and now to some consolation of our own imagination or our own psychic life does not seemingly fulfill the job that nature wanted us to achieve. Nature wants us to go on and grow and have new experiences. And when an old book is closed, it is not always wise to try and pry it open. Let us rather seek the new book and the lesson that is written therein. Here are two in a little envelope. You see, these questions are very much in the same general trend. Do you believe it possible for any message to be delivered to us from beyond the curtain? How do you account for vivid appearances of departed loved ones in dreams? Persons who believed in an always existing life, though existing in other dimensions or perhaps other layers of consciousness, and who had promised to come through if at all possible. Well, part of the question we've already answered, but there is an element in here that we haven't touched on. Therefore, let us work particularly with that phase of it. How do you account for vivid appearances of departed loved ones in dreams? This can be answered in several ways. We know that from the beginning of time, the subconscious images and likenesses of persons have been retained within our own mental emotional structure and will come through in dreams. Dreams are therefore living memories, or memories vitalized by sleep phenomena. And it is not necessarily true that a dream does imply a person has attempted to contact us. It may only be our own wishful thinking. It can only be our own subconscious memory. And because dreams are frequently symbolical, and because they do not appear when we expect them to, for the most part, we cannot say either that because we dream of someone whom we have not been thinking about consciously, that this is a valid proof that this is not a subconscious image. It can well be so. Where we have lost a person to whom we depended, upon whom we leaned heavily, particularly for counsel, example, or advice, our own subconscious seeking to come through with advice or help may use the form or likeness, the mental image of the departed person as the symbol of the teacher. Thus, advice coming to us from our own subconscious may occasionally enclose itself in forms of persons with whom we have been associated on the receptive end of advice and counsel. Among man's psychological structures within himself is the teacher image. The teacher image can take many forms. The young man who had a very wise, loving, and intelligent father may be taught through the teacher image from his own psychic overself, but the teacher image may take the form of his father. In the same way, a person who had a very unpleasant stepmother who was very cruel. This becomes the evil image. And whenever trouble arises, or when some cruel impulse arises, it will come into the objective consciousness through the stepmother image, which becomes the concept of the old witch in the fairy story. These are psychic images within ourselves. If we love deeply, love images will be of loved ones. And it is quite possible for a person who has heavily depended for leadership upon another person, if this person is removed and the leadership is restored to the psychic self, that this psychic self will impress itself upon consciousness in dream, vision, or even in waking experience by taking the form of the familiar teacher image, or the supporting image, or the parent image, or the religious image. In Christendom, religious revelation nearly always appears accompanied by dream or visions of saints, sanctified persons, Jesus, or the Virgin Mary. This is because it is common to our faith to expect spiritual revelation to come from this source. And this image is our own messianic, psychic self. In another country, another people, if the same thing happened to a Muslim, he might very well see the Prophet Muhammad or one of the green-robed saints appearing to him to deliver the same type of message. The message comes through the religious teacher self, and this symbol is always the symbol of things near or revered. Therefore, it is quite possible for comfort to come to us in the image of the person with whom we most associate comfort in our lives, that understanding shall come in the same way, and that these images shall arise in dreams and visions to symbolize the qualities with which we have associated these persons. So we cannot say that the appearance of anyone is an absolute indication that the person themselves is present. The same is true in connection with a variety of other dreams. There have been strong dream visions and personifications of persons who are not dead. I knew an individual who had many recurrent dreams about a certain individual he greatly admired who was perfectly alive and well. The dream does not necessarily imply the death image, but it frequently does when our own attitude is a little negative, a little fearful, and we are seeking consolation or strength. We then turn to the images which are most likely to associate this quality. We do not do it consciously. We are not making it up out of any make-believe. We are simply making use of a psychological mechanism that is now rather well known and understood. Well, let's see. This first question asks me whether I accept the teachings of a certain man relating to the presence of Christ and Buddha as merely intense thought symbols or as actual physical manifestations. I would say that in the majority of instances, the appearances of divine persons may be regarded as thought or religion or folk symbols. Now this might come as a shock, and we do not say that this is inevitably and invariably true. But I think we have certain questions we have a right to ask ourselves. One of these questions, and I've asked it to many persons who felt that they had received a powerful messianic call, or a powerful intercession of some kind by supreme and mighty beings beyond this world. I asked one individual, in fact I've asked many, why were you picked to receive so important a communication? In the majority of cases, the individual couldn't even make a feeble guess. And a study of the individual did not indicate that they had any type of attribute or qualification that would seem to make them so selected. But if they believed that they were so selected and tried to go out and do something consistent with the experience which they believed they had had, they nearly always dismally failed, because they had no attributes, no known abilities, no peculiar training suitable for the things they believed they were called to accomplish. And under such conditions, one is almost impelled to believe that if the experience was true, if a great and divine being had actually come and elected someone to do a particular job, that being would either help them to do it, or would know that they couldn't do it without help, or else would choose somebody able to do it. These seem such reasonable conclusions that I am inclined to suspect that where a person of poor organization believes they have been favored with some extraordinary mission or vision or experience, and then proceeded down through the years to be able to do nothing worthwhile with it, I am inclined to suspect that we are in the presence of a psychological phenomenon. I think we are in the presence of a kind of a phenomenon in which the lonely, neglected person, or the individual very insecure in himself, seeking in some desperate way to make a comparatively insignificant life important, has created this symbolism in himself. He believes it, he is certain of it, he is perfectly honest, but he cannot answer the simple question of why should it have happened to him. Sometimes he makes a point of not being able to answer it, feeling that it is all locked in the mystery of God. But where the consequences, as is usually the case, are not consistent, where the promises made are not kept, where the doors that were supposed to open did not open, where the strength and understanding needed was not provided, I think we may doubt the basic integrity of the circumstance. I think it is also quite true that elaborate reading in various fields of metaphysics may result in a variety of dream phenomena which can be exceedingly confusing. As I have said on other occasions, if you read a detective story late at night and then woke in the middle of the night with a feeling that someone was under the bed, you would very quickly decide that it was the result of your reading. But if you read a very nice fragment of abstract metaphysics, and in that same night you have a dream that you are initiated in the pyramids of Egypt, it all seems very real and very probable. But I think most of it belongs under what I have long referred to as mince pie clairvoyance. Now here's another question that I think is rather interesting. Relative to the state of a loved one who may have taken her own life, or contributed thereto, is such a one suffering in the hereafter? If so, when will it end? If so, how can we on this plane be of genuine assistance to such a departed loved one? This, I think, is a very interesting and valuable question. Not necessarily because it is too common an occurrence these days, but because it is probably one of the pivotal questions of a great many ethical problems. The question as to the fact of the spiritual significance of suicide is one that has been tossed around by more religions, more cults, and more organizations than perhaps any other ethical question involving human immortality. And the findings to the present time have been so diverse and so inconsistent that I think we are left very largely upon our own resources. Among many peoples, there has been a strong sense of moral responsibility for life, and the individual who takes his own life is theoretically considered to have committed a crime, even though he cannot be punished for it. And as such, it still remains upon the statute books of our nation. On the other hand, in other nations and at other times, this attitude has not been nearly so clearly indicated. Plato probably was one of the minds that we most honor in principle in thinking. Gives a list of conditions under which suicide may be regarded as legitimate, and therefore may be regarded as not violating any of the essential laws of nature. Plato and many others, of course, have made the tremendously vital point that penalty and reward, judgment, pro and con, for and against, are all largely conditioned by motive. That the most important thing in this world in relationship to all action is motive. Therefore, Plato brings the problem of suicide flatly and squarely onto the ground of motive. If the individual commits suicide to escape any of the normal responsibilities of life, to escape payment for reasonable debts, to escape disgrace for evils actually committed by that person, or in any way as an escape, which means that this individual is unwilling or disinclined to face the consequences of his own conduct, then such an action is regarded as an offense by Plato against the gods. If, however, this action is not so motivated, there are certain extenuating circumstances. One of these is if the person committing the act be of unsound mind at the time of the commission of the act. If the individual is not in mental control of his own faculties, he is not responsible for his action. And this loss of a mental control for action, due to any number of possible causations, some of which are apparently beyond the power of the individual at this time in his evolution. Under such conditions, he is not held responsible, and it is not regarded that it will have any circumstance upon his afterlife that may be regarded as evil or wrong. Actually, a very large amount of so-called heroism is virtually suicide. An individual accepting in war a suicide mission, from which there is no probable or almost possible opportunity or chance of survival, is actually, for all intent and purposes, condemning himself to death and killing himself. But because of motive and circumstances, Plato says he is held free of guilt. Because the purpose for which he sacrificed his life was not the convenience of himself or the exoneration of himself, but in the service of principles which he regarded to be higher than life. And where this is the case, the individual is judged by his motive and not by his action. Another reason that Plato points out is that if for any cause or reason an individual is placed in a situation in which he must disgrace his own soul, in which he must be untrue to his own spiritual conviction, if he must live contrary to principle, to live at all, he then has the right to die. Or if he is required by torture, which he may not be able to sustain, or by any other circumstances, to divulge the secrets of the mysteries, to give out such knowledge as is not proper to the profane, or through some circumstance to expose or reveal that by means of which he will cause great hardship, death, suffering, or crime to other persons, such an individual, doubting his own capacity to survive, doubting that his own strength is great enough to permit him to survive an ordeal of this nature, may choose suicide. And because in so doing he protects others, or protects truth, or protects virtue, or preserves his nation or other persons from sorrow, misery, torture, and death, for which perhaps they are not deserving, under these conditions he is entitled to take his own life. Now these are certain conditions and states. Now up to the present time we have also observed that among other nations, as for example in Japan, suicide for certain reasons is considered not only honorable, but highly commendable. Yet we cannot assume that these persons, having these convictions, and having no revelation of understanding within themselves to counteract these convictions, but holding these convictions as sacred truth, as derived from their gods, we cannot assume that these persons will be punished for their honorable action. Thus, in nature, as in psychology, we are beginning to realize that motivation is becoming a great factor, and that as man has to live with his own internal life when he departs from this world, that it is his own internal life that must be right. So his decision depends very largely upon this. There is also the conviction rising more and more among our people today that unnecessary suffering in case of hopeless sickness, that the individual has a right to request or to ask to be removed from suffering, inasmuch as we would not permit a lesser creature to endure the same agony. These are problems of ethics. Some of them are problems of law. All of such problems as these are subject to abuse, which is one of the great drawbacks in the clearing of any such issue. But the fact that we want to make as clear as we can is that motive is the predominant factor, and that the individual who does that which to the best of his consciousness is right might find that he is wrong, but he will suffer no enduring damage if that which he did was the best that he knew. I do not go with this idea at all, that an individual is going to be judged by what somebody else thinks, or that he is going to be judged by some group, sect, or organization that may or may not have any understanding of the problem which he faces. I believe that each individual is judged upon the merit and demerit of his own conduct, and that this judgment arises from his own internal ability to say, I did that which I believe to be right, and mean it. Not an assumption or a platitude or an hypocrisy, but a fact as far as that person was concerned. If that is his case, I think he is justified in assuming that that which is the best that he knew will be acceptable to those powers which fully understand, better than we do, the frailties of the human soul. So I would say that that is the case. If the person, out of selfish or insincere motive, or for mere purposes of evasion or avoidance, being of sound mind, simply declines to accept the responsibilities of life, or like the one man in the Depression in 29, who started out with $10 million, and when the Depression had taken away $6 and he had only $4 million left, he killed himself because he couldn't live on $4 million. This individual, I think, has something coming to him. But he would probably also have had something coming to him if he'd stayed here. His thinking, his life, his patterns were all wrong. And he merely added another wrong to a whole pattern of them. In other words, he consummated a series of wrongs by an action consistent with that series. That person, I believe, must face not hellfire and damnation or the loss of his immortal soul, but more in the concept of the Mikado. He must face a punishment that fits the crime. He must face the consideration of his own mistake. Now, assuming for the moment that the person commits suicide or contributes to it for selfish or evasion motives, simply because he doesn't want to carry the full and due responsibility of life, he'd be of mature years and sound mind make such a decision. Then it was held by many ancient peoples and most ancient philosophers that that individual remained earthbound, or held to the etheric atmosphere of this earth, held by subtle parts of his consciousness and by subtle parts of his body, from which he had caused a violent separation until the natural end of his life. And that during that time he lived, so to say, between two worlds, and must observe and see things occur, which might not have occurred had he lived, and which he now cannot prevent, and thereby creating certain compensations or punishments suitable to his needs. If the person under these conditions has this to face, then our best attitude toward that person is certainly not one of blame, certainly not one of criticism or condemnation, or why did you do it, or you shouldn't have done it. Both of these elements are by this time well known to the deceased and contribute nothing to the problem. The only thing that we can do there is to hold a good constructive thought that these are ripples upon the sea of life, that these things have happened to all of us, perhaps many times, and that therefore nature in its infinite wisdom will give us a certain reprimand, a certain inevitable correction of perspective, and then we will go on and build our destiny according to the laws of nature. That these things are not permanent, because man is not yet sufficiently wise, sufficiently strong, sufficiently internally fortified, so that it can be depended upon him that he will always make correct decisions. Therefore, as he is not infallible in his own life, he cannot create an ultimate situation for himself. These things belong to the passing circumstances of existence and should not be considered in any other way. Now, I'm going to pick out here 2 or 3 questions from the preceding talk that we didn't quite get to answer, so that some of you who asked questions before might catch a note at this time. Could the understanding of our personal temperaments be a key to self-improvement? Tremendously so, ultimately so, inevitably so. Amen. There is no question whatever that the more completely we understand ourselves, the more quickly we can learn to improve ourselves. Socrates says the proper study of mankind is man. And over the gate of the ancient Egyptian temple was the statement, man, know thyself. Therefore we may say that to understand our temperaments is of the greatest importance. But understanding does not mean acceptance without question. Understanding does not mean exoneration. Understanding does not mean criticism. It means, in the Zen sense, true evaluation. Understanding is that which enables us to see the wrongness and rightness in that which we think and feel and do. And that wherever we are aware of the wrongness, we are immediately inspired to correct the wrong. To understand ourselves merely by a platitude and say, well, I guess we all do the best we can, is nothing. But to understand ourselves as imperfect beings, naturally subject to mistakes, and to further understand that any time we make a mistake, it is natural. But if we make the same mistake several times, it is an indication of subnormal mentality. That we must learn from our mistakes, not to do those things which prove themselves to be wrong. Also that in our self-analysis, in our effort to understand our personal temperaments, we must not assume that other people will understand in the same way. Therefore, we may sometimes condone ourselves and take refuge in our own understanding against the criticisms of those around us. A wise man listens to the criticism of his friend. We may not accept all criticisms, but we should never reject them without due consideration. Therefore, in our temperament study, we should learn to understand ourselves. And the better we understand ourselves, the better we will know the next thing that we need to do in order to grow. And that is why we understand, is because we want to be better. Therefore, all understanding must lead to dynamic incentive for further personal development. Here someone wants to know how they can attain a more even temperament. Well, abstractly, scientifically speaking, an uneven temperament means the unequal development of faculties. An individual whose temperament is not even, means that as he moves from one group of faculties to another, or the pressures upon the patterns of his personality become greater or less, that there are marked changes in his disposition. Therefore, in order to attain a more even temperament, we have to outgrow certain situations by which the placity of our temperament is destroyed. If, for example, in an uneven temperament, we discover that there are moments when jealousy flashes in on us, or hatreds rise, or suspicions come, or we have the inevitable instinct to be critical, or to worry, or to condemn, even though much of the time we have a good disposition. One person told me once that they had an excellent disposition until someone else annoyed them. This is a more or less classic example of the problem. But the fact that we can lose a good disposition really means we never had it. Because in nature, qualities which we truly possess, we cannot lose. What we had was a partial disposition. We had that disposition which was a mixture of success and failure, just as it appears at any given moment. The fact that we are able to handle some situations better than others is simply an indication of the degree of the development and coordination of our faculties. Wherever, therefore, our disposition is inadequate, it means that there is a weakness in our philosophy of life in that area. And this weakness in our philosophy of life may stem back to selfishness or any one of 3 or 4 basic emotional pressures or mental pressures from which we are all inclined to suffer. Observe, therefore, those types of situations in which the disposition is inadequate. You may find they form a pattern. You may find, therefore, that you are peculiarly vulnerable in one area of the personality. If so, there's where you have to go to work. And instead of attacking the weakness head on and resolving not to do this particular thing, which will only end in emotional frustration, and you'll probably end up by doing it anyway, the point is to enlighten or enlarge the understanding behind the attitudes which lead us into that difficulty. Therefore, growth, development, and the balance of life will help in any particular situation. I know one case of a person who was peculiarly jealous. Not all the time, but there were certain situations in which jealousy appeared to be irresistible. The person was living a much too small life. They had too much time to themselves, too many opportunities to compare themselves unfavorably with the achievements of other people. This person finally decided to take up ballroom dancing. And after learning to dance for about 6 months, the jealousy fits became very sparse, almost disappeared. Not because the jealousy factor had been touched at all, but because in this case the jealousy was a kind of envy. The person couldn't do anything very well. But after he learned to be a good dancer, at least he could do that fairly well, and people told him he was good at it, and he was no longer envious of what other people did, because he had accomplished something himself. So the same can be true in art or music or business or almost any situation. Usually our peculiarly small emotion rises from some inadequacy. And if we can correct the inadequacy in principle, the problem falls away. We do not have to argue with it and fight with it day after day. It is much better to get at the fact or the basis of the thing than it is to worry about the particulars. Here is a question. What are the basic principles behind the introvert and the extrovert? And how much of a part do the planets play in this regard? The planets play some part in this, undoubtedly, because they provide the vehicles through which certain faculties and functions must manifest. Normally in planetary situations, the positive signs are inclined to be extroverted, and the negative signs are inclined to be introverted. Now, we could go into that more in detail, but there are many available texts on the subject. What are the basic principles behind the introvert and the extrovert? An introvert is actually an individual who enlarges his internal life for defensive purposes. An extrovert is a person who exaggerates his external life also for defensive purposes. The individual who has a normal and happy inner life is not an introvert. An individual who has a gay and happy outer life is not an extrovert, because both the introvert and the extrovert term imply a pressure, a false pressure, or an intensity of some kind. The introvert is therefore one who locks himself against being hurt, not because he has a good time inside. It's very much like the person who decides he'll live in prison because he's afraid of the world. And there are cases of men released from prison who have begged the warden to let them stay because they didn't want to go out into the horrible world of what we call honest folks that look more dangerous than the criminals around him. But the introvert is a person, therefore, who is locking himself in. He does not have a clear and easy path from the outer to the inner phases of his own life. He is inside because he hurts too easily. He is inside because he is afraid. Or he is inside because he is proud and not able to live up to it. He is ashamed to admit weaknesses, or does not wish to be embarrassed by other persons. Therefore, physical deformity or disfigurement frequently leads to introversion. Now, your extrovert is the individual who makes a loud noise because he is afraid to keep quiet. An extrovert is a person who is trying to sell himself on the fact that he is able to live in the outside world. He talks a little too loud. He is constantly reminding us that he is afraid. He doth protest too much, like Lady Macbeth. He is one who is trying to sell himself because he hasn't confidence in himself. Thus, the extrovert is again under pressure. He is afraid to go inside because he is not compatible. He is not adjusted with himself. The introvert, theoretically, is not adjusted with the world. But actually, both of these pressured types are running away from the norm, which is reality, which is simple, natural adjustment. An inner life and an outer life that are compatible and agreeable. The ability to be alone or with other people and be comfortable in either case. This is the desired end. But the individual who cannot make it, who is unable to adjust either to being with himself in the case of introversion or with others in the case of extroversion, tries too hard. And out of his trying he makes tension and sometimes sickness, and very often defeats his own purpose by the disfigurement and exaggeration of his character through these efforts to escape in one direction or another. Between the two is normalcy. And normalcy is a moderation in all things. And where there is normalcy, there is no pressure, no evasion, no defense, and no escape. And that is what we should all seek to achieve. In the meantime, I think a few of us might like to escape home. So I think I'll bring this session to a close for the evening. Thank you very much.